Then I have the pleasure of introducing the star of the evening. His name is Charles Douthat, often mispronounced. He is the poet, but he's also a lawyer and an artist. And I keep introducing, I'm realizing this year in particular, I've been introducing the poets as paradoxical because they are such other different things. But then I thought, well, all poets are paradoxes. I mean, you don't even need to think of William Carlos Williams and Wallace Stevens to know that some poets are librarians, and some poets are realtors, and some poets are
social worker,
energy people, ministers, yeah.
FEMA workers.
So, but we don't think of lawyers as poets, and in fact, this lawyer didn't think of himself as a poet for most of his legal life. I mean, his life.
as
He started writing poetry within the last decade. Is that right, Charles? Yeah. And he, before that, he got an AB in history from Stanford, and then a JD from Hastings College of Law, which is also on the other coast. And these are the honors he's accrued as a lawyer. This is all before he decided to become a poet. He's listed in the best lawyers in America. He was voted by his peers as one of Connecticut's super lawyers. And he's one of the, quote, outstanding lawyers in America. So what does he do? He doesn't feel well. He picks up a pen. He starts to write. 7 years. I've been writing poetry since kindergarten. Charles starts 7 years ago. He writes a book. He gets it published, and instantly he wins the L.L. Winship 10 New England Poetry Awards for the best book by a New England author. Oh, it's an outrage. And that book is called Blue for Oceans, and it is that from which he will read tonight with some new poems, I think, probably too. He, even more signally, has been read not once and not twice, but 3 times on the Writer's Almanac by Garrison Keillor. Yeah. And one called Crying Man, which I think you're going to read tonight. Maybe you should now. Was read on the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 tragedy. So that's pretty wonderful, Charles. Now, I went to a bunch of websites that are devoted to Charles, and one of the most interesting ones, well, I have to say, I also listened to an interview between him and some woman who seems to be famous, who said that she had tried to buy a copy of his book and had looked it up on Amazon.com, and the only copy she could find was $100, to which Charles responded, "That can't be true." Anyway, these are my favorite of his recent legal triumphs, and I'm going to tell you these because I think they have something to do with him as a poet. This is my favorite one. He got a settlement of, or he won a, whatever you call it, a prize. What do you call it?
a settlement.
A settlement? No, it wasn't a settlement. But anyway, he won a, whatever that judge calls it, award. $1.4 million for an older woman who fell in the emergency room and had to spend the rest of her life in a nursing home. She was offered, the settlement offered by the hospital, he sued the hospital, was $50,000.
Oh.
He went to trial and won her $1.4 million. And this just gives me so much hope. Right here. He did stuff nobody else ever thought of doing. For example, he got $1 million award for a girl blinded by a virus that a puppy she got from a puppy mill had. And what he did that no one else had ever thought of doing was to bring in the Connecticut Product Liability Act, I think it's called, and got the puppy labeled a dangerous product. That's how he got her $1 million. And then there was a medical malpractice suit, which he won for $4.2 million that had been rejected by everybody else because it would have been too difficult to prove. So this is Charles as a lawyer. And this is my theory about the connection between what he does as a lawyer and what he does as a poet. You know, how is this impulse to advocate, which is clearly what you've decided to do with your legal career, how is it represented in his writing? And I think he spends his legal day, 7-day weeks, years on end for a single trial, fighting one battle for someone threatened with the likelihood of falling into the ranks of the forgotten. And what I think his poems do, as you will hear, and do with a very deft hand, is to save memories, moments of imperfection, imperfect happiness, imperfect people, imperfect moments from oblivion. And can I just read the polishings? Because I think it's such a nice example. Yeah? Okay. This is what I think represents what he does in his poetry, that is advocacy of a kind for the underheard. The polishings. In the warm painted porch of our old stucco house, at the legged laundry sink covered with a plywood board, my father taught me as a boy, as he'd been taught, how a salesman ought to polish his good shoes. Make them shine enough to speak, he insisted. They're your first step through the door. He'd spread out newspapers, rags and brushes, and metal tins that twisted open with a pop, revealing creams, deep brown, black, cordovan. He taught me by doing. The rag doubled to keep the gob of polish from bleeding through. The non-master hand like a foot inside the worked-on shoe to hold it steady. The thorough coating and spreading over leather of waxy color, starting from scuffed toe, then down the instep side to heel and back to toe. Once both shoes were creamed over, he lit a cigarette to let the glazed pair dry. Hurried brushing, he'd say, made a short-lived shine that wouldn't last half a day of cold calls on the road. My father knew so much in his handsome hands, gilded with a rectangled wristwatch, a wedding band, and between knuckles, wiry sprays of golden hair. I can still see one good hand hidden inside a brogue, the other gripping the wooden brush as it bristled out a leathered glow. How long did they last, those lessons on the porch? 1 year? 2? How long the morning polishings with the jobless day before him, and a son watching, a wife waiting, and no door but ours to walk through. I'm so excited to introduce Charles Douthat.
Wow, that was some introduction. And some reading, I must say. I don't often get to hear my poems read aloud by other people. So I want to thank Nan for spending the time to let you know a little bit about me. I want to thank the Guild for inviting me to come tonight. I've come here to hear other poets read, and I know it's always a very welcoming and understanding place. I'm going to read some poems tonight from my book, Blue for Oceans. I'm going to read a couple of new poems tonight, too. The first poem is called Green. Though I grew up in California, I've now lived in New Haven for over 30 years. And one thing about living in a place for a long time is that its geography, the streets, the buildings, even the trees, become markers of our own personal history. This first poem tries to capture one of those moments when suddenly one place becomes more than one place as you remember a different time in your life. Green. Some days I walk down the street where we live, and the fat man who stole tomatoes sits under the same old sycamore, tapping out his angry rhythms on the knotted roots. And though the children are no longer ours, the oaks are no less generous to the sidewalks with their shade. Overhead, sweet air still arrives through many simple branches, some reaching skyward for joy, others downcast for a reason. We were like good trees the years we lived on this street. We were so green, fresh as leaves, and the days whispered through us. I have two wonderful, now grown-up children, and they appear from time to time in my poems when they were much younger. Early on, I had some issues about reading these poems publicly. I felt my kids had a right to privacy, and it should be their own to maintain or lose. But then my son grew up to be a writer, and he wrote a book, and I appeared in that book. He didn't ask my permission, and I thought he kind of gave me short shrift in that book. So now I feel free to return the favor in poems about him. But the poem I'm about to read features my daughter as a young girl. She's now a sophisticated college graduate, employed, I'm happy to say, with medical insurance coverage. But I read this poem to her recently to see if she'd be embarrassed by it, and she was fine with it, but she said wisely, "This poem isn't about me, Dad, it's about you." The poem's called This Wreck. And yes, to answer your first question, that old car is my car in the front yard with 3 stained hubcaps and weeds growing up around the soft tires and a bird-shit spattered hood that last fall's leaves have worked under. And yes, it was a well-polished maroon when I bought it those years ago. A time I remember my wife being pregnant again and wanting a reliable car that wouldn't break down during labor or on the way to the hospital, or as it happened, on that unforeseen third morning of her life when we drove our daughter away from home after midnight, blanketed in a new blue car seat, running a funny little newborn fever. Her doctor cleared his telephone voice about before saying he'd be waiting in the emergency room when we came in. And yes, he was there in his brown cardigan after we made the harrowing 5-mile drive. And he stayed with us in the brilliant examining room as specialists appeared in their coats, and the one upholding a spinal tap syringe after seeing my face suggested we'd all be better off if I waited in the next room. And yes, there followed some weeks cut off at the knees and stunned cigarette hours in the unforgettable hospital parking garage before being hauled off like freight to my next stop by gasoline exploding in the cylinders. And yes, fortunately, the meningitis was caught early. And she was a lucky girl, the doctor said, and we were all lucky then and now that she's better than okay with her dancing and her clean brown hair pinned up in a bun. And yes, you can understand how sometimes these high summer evenings home late from work, I open all 4 doors of the old car until the steaming inside swollen air escapes. And settling into one broken seat or another, I look out through the chipped windshield, inhaling the stale, sour, wonderful sun-blasted upholstery smell. And then I try thinking of nothing but road maps baking safely in the glove box, and ballet shoes being tied by small fingers, and nobody going anywhere ever again in this wreck that will stay in my yard. Thank you, dear God, for as long as the rest of this takes. So I'm an old poet, and I started late, and I have had a chance to hang out with some young poets who were very cutting edge and avant-garde and far out and interesting, and I'm none of those things. And yet, I feel sometimes like my poems are a little too simple and straightforward. And I wrote one recently that I thought was really simple and straightforward, and I decided to do an experiment with it. And what I did was I took the poem and I wrote it backwards. And I turned the first word into the last word, and the second to the first word into the, the second to the last word, and anyway, you get the idea. And it turned out to be a very interesting poem in a weird sort of way. I'm going to read both poems now. The first, the straight version, and the second, the upside down and backwards version. I think they're both poems. They kind of fit together interestingly. See what you think. The first poem is called Early. I woke early, went out to see morning come to the mountains. The quiet in the valley before dawn was the idea of night I love best. Somewhere birds were thinking of singing. Looking up from the open porch, I was everywhere drawn up through a blue-black, star-backed crown of trees. Then it happened, moment lasting more than a moment, as mountain light faintly ridged the eastern sky. The new day's wait was over. Morning heavened east to west, and the stars went out over the valley. Here's the backwards version. It's titled Early Woke I. Valley the over out went, stars the and west to east heavened morning. Over was wait, days new, the sky eastern, the ridge faintly light, mountain as moment, then more lasting moment. Happened it then, trees of star-backed, blue-black, a through updrawn everywhere was I. Porch open, the from up looking, singing of thinking were birds somewhere. Best love I, night of idea, the was dawn before valley, the in quiet, the mountains, the to come morning, see to, out went, early woke I. So the next poem I'm going to read is about a dear friend who happens to be here tonight. As you'll learn from the poem, her being here is very, very good news. Cancer is a club that no one wants to belong to, and the minute one of us is forced to join, we desperately try to join the more exclusive club reserved for those who survive cancer. It's a raw time in life after you get diagnosed, and before you learn whether you get into that second club or not. This poem is set during that difficult time. It's called Scent of Melons. Let sorrow always greet me as you greeted me at your door that day, like an old friend, and with a kiss, and on the mouth for once, directly, as earlier on the phone you'd said, always better to know. Together we cleared the table of the half-wrapped fruit baskets, the get well cards, the sets of boxed herb teas your patients had sent over. Then we talked, sunlight's morning edge on the kitchen floor. I drank coffee, ate cantaloupe, asked questions. Like a hat, your wig hung on the next chair, explaining about lymph nodes and the distances a bad breast cell can travel. You touched yourself to show how far. Here to here, she said, sometimes here. So our kitchen talk went on. Sunlight reached the table. Momentarily, the scent of melons was in the air. And when you felt I knew enough, the conversation turned other ways. Your son's new middle school, my daughter giving up her dance, our last trips to the coast, and then, while there was still time, other friends and days. So some poems come into being very quickly, and I think people who don't write poems imagine that as poets we sit down, the sun comes up, we're inspired, and we write a poem out and it's done by lunchtime. The poem I'm going to read now is not a long poem, but it took me over a year, a couple of years really, almost to finish. I got the first part of it one winter, but the second part of it wouldn't come. It was stuck out there somewhere where the endings to poems hide, and it wasn't until the next winter that I finally got the last lines. Writing the poem was a lesson about hope, I suppose, which, as it happens, is what the poem is about. It's called Winter Hill. If you could watch with me the winter melt down the long face of my neighbor's sledding hill, you'd see it melting first where children melt, and slid and trampled trails a month ago. This February slope, once packed and slick as glass, now drips with footprints by the hundreds, and half a dozen spreading stripes of grass the longer days have finally melted through. The paper warns it's just an early thaw. Still, this sight of old depressions sunning in the snow refreshes for this hour, as nature sometimes will, a view in me I thought would never green. We know our hopes by light and season, like any slope or greening thing. Sometimes they trick us, but why complain? We're made to wait on hope, as every winter hill is made to wait for spring. As Nan mentioned, after my book came out, I was surprised and thrilled that several of the poems were chosen by Garrison Keillor to be read on his poetry show on National Public Radio. This next poem is one that he chose, and you can imagine, I listened the day that he recited my poem, and then it's online, and you can really go back and listen to it as many times as you want to. But it was strange to hear that voice that we know from Prairie Home Companion reading my poem. So strange that for a while afterwards, I heard his reading in my head whenever I think about this poem. I think I'm past that now, but if you hear a stranger's voice in this poem, you'll know whose it is tonight, okay? The poem's called Mrs. Miller. And to the south lived dear old Mrs. Miller, the first next-door neighbor I really knew. A doctor's widow, white-streaked, yellow hair, with a nervous New York way of talking, though she'd lived out west for 20 years. A grown daughter, Dorothy, lived with her, worked somewhere, drove a red sports car. Fruit trees grew behind their gabled house, and a crunching path of white crushed stone ended at a Japanese-style fish pond. I was tall enough then to climb the bamboo fence and pull oranges from the tree that overhung their pond. What fruit I couldn't reach fell. In January, you'd see lazy, blurred goldfish tailing beneath navels, floating on the pond. Saturdays, I'd wash Mrs. Miller's Buick with a bucket, soap, and sponge. The 15 cents she paid me was good money in '61. Later, on the lanai, she'd pour my Coke, wave away her cigarette smoke, and engage me in grown-up conversation. Since nothing ever goes according to plan, she'd say, You'd think we'd figure out the plan. I was at most 11. She was a drunk, I suppose. Confused, but open-hearted. Lonely, of course. The first person like me I'd known. Two more or three more? What do you say?
Three.
Okay.
Four.
Okay, so let me read another poem. Oh, this is a poem about my son. Okay, and it's called The Hold. I don't know about you, but I often get into trouble when I hold on to something or someone or an idea too long. At the same time, I think there's a big difference between holding on and just holding. In this poem, I try to make that distinction. See if it makes sense to you. The Hold. There it is, just before putting out the light. Here in the doorway to his room, the unmistakable smell of him, though his train pulled out an hour ago. Not a child's smell anymore, but a young man's air of college nights and long wool coats and jokes so cool they cannot be explained. You had to be there, Dad, he says. Now in his scented wake I wait, knowing he'll soon be gone for good, graduating to some new city, paying too much rent. And this room where for years he slept and read while brown hair broke through on his face and chest. Soon it will be a place for someone else to rest, but not quite yet. This fragrant air is sweet to me tonight. The dusty heat rising from baseboard vents, the windows tight. His house-worn high school books upright in their case. Like me, they've done their work. What we instructors had to say has all been said, and what he took to heart is as unfathomable now as what he cast away. For he's moving on and on his own to worlds he'll live to see, but I will never fully know. Of course he'll stop again to sleep and eat. We'll speak again of Charlemagne and Russell Crowe, but the being of him, that second self housed for years nearly inside my skin, is elsewhere, flowing on, flown. How does a father live, I wonder? But it's late now. At the stair, my wife is calling, and so I remember that morning my son was first handed to me, still blood-smudged and burst-slippery. And because I was a new father then, and because my inexperience showed, the midwife taught me how to hold a child properly. Lightly now, she cautioned, but also pulling at my arms, testing me, until I sensed what it meant not to let go. So I had the luxury this summer of spending a week in a cabin by a small river up in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. The river had many stones in it, fallen down from the canyon hillsides and washed smooth by the current. Night and day, you could hear the river rushing over the stones. This poem's called I Came to the Mountains. I came to the mountains to sit by the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river. To the mountains I traveled to grieve by the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river. Among mountains I suffered my rage by the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river. Beneath mountains I gathered regrets by the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river. In the mountains I laid down my hopes by the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river. So the mountains entered my heart by the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river. And the mountains taught me to sing by the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river. Then the mountains left me to sit by the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river, stone in the river. The last poem I'm going to read tonight is the last poem in my book, Blue for Oceans. It's also the title poem. When we pick up a book of poetry at a bookstore, don't we often leaf through to the title poem, and often aren't we puzzled as to why the poet named the book after that poem? Not to give a secret away, but my book, Blue for Oceans, is about the end of a period in my life, looking back at it, remembering, and saying goodbye. And I think that's what this poem is about too. Blue for Oceans. Astonishing that he could forget and remember so. California, for example. The trees, for some reason, especially. Leaving but not losing them. Believing he never would. Then one day finding March and April gone without a thought for the peeling eucalyptus, the palms leaning long avenues, the hazy skybank timberlines of the Coast Range. Years later, in a stucco house outside Rome, he woke again to the same yellow-brown light, the dry tile roofs. But the trees were wrong. Pointed cedars, not aspen or Santa Rosa plum. Groves of olives, not redwoods. Afterwards, the last clear time was an evening with his daughter, making a map of the world out of clay, painting in brown for mountains and blue for oceans, reading about the scientist who first claimed Africa and America were once joined. On each side, long ago animals and jungle birds watched from trees as a last narrowing isthmus washed away. For some time after, the gap remained a slight stream, easily forded or even leaped across one continent to another. Then years widened the strait, and far shores fell away, until only a gull or a seed on a great wind could cross over the space that was once a world. That's it.
Anniversary of 9/11. Sorry, Charlie.
That's okay.
They said 4.
Yeah.
I'll go.
Yeah, here it is. Okay, I mean, this is not exactly an uplifting poem to end the reading on, but
So we can take it.
here it goes.
We're going.
Okay. Wallace Stevens said that the world, it's not every day that the world composes itself into a poem. The trick for me and for other poets is to recognize the poem when the world presents it to you. In the case of this poem, it happened in an airport. It's called Crying Man. At O'Hare, after a first jump west to California, I thought my father was dying as I waited for the connecting flight. Being hungry, I ate pizza with the people eating pizza. Feeling uninformed, I bought newspapers, opened magazines at a bookshop wall. Near my gate, I pretended not to watch a dozen others waiting, as they pretended not to watch me. But finally, in a hectic airport restroom, I heard the crying man in his stall. "Oh God," he cried behind a stained steel door. He didn't sound old, and in his privacy, not shy. "Oh dear God," rang harshly in the close tiled room. I stood alongside others, a simple traveler at a public urinal. Behind me, the restless waited their turns. "Oh dear life," came the third cry. I shook myself, zipped, found a vacant sink for washing. Spurting water dwindled to a trickle on my hands. I lathered and rinsed as I'd been taught, grabbed for paper towel, did not linger at the mirror. That enough?